Tear his sign down. This is our lake now.
That's what the HOA president screamed as her contractor ripped my private property sign out of the soil and tossed it into the bed of a pickup truck. I stood at my own gate watching 20 workers pour concrete pylons into the shoreline of a lake my grandfather hand-built in 1952. She'd called it a community amenity in 3 press releases. She'd never once asked my permission. She'd never even checked who owned the deed. That's the thing about people drunk on HOA power. They start believing the rules they write apply to land they don't own. What she didn't know was that I am the licensed dam operator for that lake, and every drop of water in it answers to a single valve on my property. So I didn't argue. I drove home, opened my logbook, and started a timeline. Tell me below, what would you have done? My name is Wyatt Hollister, and the lake the HOA stole from me has a name too. My grandfather called it Junebug Pond, after my grandmother. He built it himself in the spring of 1952, hauling clay by mule and pouring the spillway concrete out of a wheelbarrow. He bought the surrounding 180 acres in Bonner County, Idaho, with money he saved working a sawmill 12 hours a day for 14 years. He left it to my father. My father left it to me. I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the Army Corps, specializing in earthen dam design and hydraulic structures. I have a state dam safety license number that fits in a wallet sleeve. I know exactly how much water moves through a 6-inch siphon line at full draw, and I know exactly how long it takes to empty an 18-acre impoundment when the spring inflow is choked off at the source. I retired 4 years ago to take care of my wife, June. Pancreatic cancer. We made it 11 months. She wanted to die at the lake, and we made that happen. She's buried in a small clearing under a young white pine on the south slope, where the morning sun hits the water first. After June passed, my daughter Hannah moved to Boise for college. The lake house went quiet in a way that took months to get used to. The smell of wood smoke from the stove in October became my favorite sound, if a smell can be a sound. The crunch of frost on the gravel under my boots became my routine. Then, 2 summers ago, the developer arrived. A construction company out of Coeur d'Alene clear-cut 110 acres of pine forest on the parcel directly north of my line. Within 14 months, a gated subdivision called Lakeshore Pines Estates was built where elk used to bed down. 42 custom homes, average price $1.6 million, all of them oriented to overlook Junebug Pond, my grandfather's pond. The HOA was incorporated before the first house sold. Their president was a woman named Diane Keller. She and her husband Tom moved into the largest of the 42 homes, a 4,000 square foot timber frame thing with floodlights that lit up half my shoreline at night. Tom Keller, I would later learn, sat on the Bonner County Planning Commission. Diane carried herself like she owned the road, the lake, and any opinion that disagreed with hers. She drove a white Range Rover with a vanity plate that said Lake Q. She wore linen blazers over yoga pants and tinted sunglasses indoors. The first letter came in June, on Lakeshore Pines letterhead. It welcomed me to the neighborhood, 4 years after I'd already lived there for 31. It informed me that Junebug Pond would be listed in the new community amenity package as the Lakeshore Pines Reflection Lagoon. It asked me to remove my private dock, which had stood on those pilings since 1978, so the HOA could harmonize the shoreline aesthetic. I read it twice. I poured a cup of coffee. I drove the letter into town, made 3 copies at the library, and put one in a binder I labeled in pencil on the spine. The binder was thin then. It would not stay thin. The Marina construction began the week I drove to Boise to help Hannah move into her sophomore year apartment. I left on a Thursday morning with my truck loaded with boxes of her grandmother's dishes and a folding bookshelf I'd built her over the winter. I told her I'd be back in 3 days. The clouds over the bitterroots looked like spilled cream. I slept on her couch with the dog at my feet. I stayed an extra night because she asked. We watched an old movie about a fishing boat. She fell asleep with her head on my shoulder for the first time since she was 7. I drove home Sunday morning with the windows down and the radio playing something country and quiet. I knew something was wrong before I saw the lake. I could hear it from a half-mile out. Heavy equipment, diesel engines, the rhythmic clank of a pile driver. By the time I crested the rise, I could see what they had done. A construction crew of about 20 men was working on my shoreline. A barge with a crane sat in the middle of the pond. They had already driven 6 concrete pylons into the bed of the lake. A bulldozer had carved a 100-foot ramp into the eastern bank, where the slope used to be carpeted in lupine. A modular gazebo, partially assembled, sat on the gravel where my mailbox used to be. My private property, no trespassing sign, was leaning sideways in the dirt. Diane Keller stood at the gate in a coral linen blazer, holding a clipboard. I stopped my truck 20 feet short, climbed out slow, and walked up. The dog stayed in the cab, low growl in his throat. "Mr. Hollister," Diane said, like she was greeting a lost child. "I left you 3 notices. The board voted unanimously. We're proceeding with the Marina installation as approved by the county." "This is private property," I said. She gave a small, theatrical sigh. "We've executed a shared-use easement. Your dock will be incorporated into the community structure. The board has graciously left your access intact." She handed me a thin manila folder. Inside was a single page that called itself a shared-use easement agreement. It was signed by Diane Keller as HOA president, by Tom Keller as Planning Commission liaison, and by a notary I didn't recognize. There was no signature from me. There was no signature from any prior owner of my parcel. A document is not an easement just because it claims to be one. An easement requires a signed grantor, recording in the county registry, and the consent of the actual property owner, or a court order, or a condemnation under eminent domain. None of those things had happened. That's the simple truth I want every homeowner to remember. If you didn't sign it, and a judge didn't order it, and the government didn't condemn for it, then it is not real, no matter how much letterhead it has at the top. I didn't tell Diane any of that. I just folded the page, slid it into my jacket pocket, and looked at the pile driver in the middle of my grandfather's pond. "How much is this project costing?" I asked. She smiled like I'd asked the time. $2,200,000. The board approved a special assessment. Each home contributed $48,000. We are building something this neighborhood deserves. I nodded once. I turned around. I walked back to my truck. I didn't slam the door. I didn't even raise my voice. I drove the half-mile back to the house, locked the gate behind me, and walked down to the spillway. I stood there for a long time, listening to the diesel engines on the far side of the trees. Then I went inside, opened the floor safe in my office, and pulled out a green-bound folder my grandfather had labeled in his own hand. The label said, "Junebug, Construction and Title, 1948 to 1952. Inside was the original deed, the original Idaho Department of Water Resources dam construction permit, the spillway design schematic, and a photograph of my grandfather standing next to the open valve of the emergency drawdown siphon. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I started the timeline. That night I drafted the first records request to Bonner County. I wrote it longhand, in a steady print, the way my grandfather wrote everything important. I asked for the construction permits issued for the Lakeshore Pines Marina. I asked for the names of every commissioner who voted on those permits. I asked for the engineering reports submitted in support. I asked for the full bid package and any contracts awarded. If they had built a marina on my lake, I wanted to know who they paid to look the other way. The next morning I drove to the county clerk's office at 7:45. I was the first person at the counter when it opened. I handed the request to a woman named Margaret, who'd been clerking there since the Reagan administration. She read it twice, looked up at me over her glasses and said, "Wyatt, you sure you want to open this one?" I told her I was. She filed it that morning. Diane Keller had $2 million of someone else's money in the water. I had a green folder, a steady hand, and a valve nobody on her side knew existed. That, as far as I was concerned, was a fair fight. The records request bought me a few weeks, but Diane wasn't waiting on paperwork. She was building a marina, and a marina needs more than pylons. It needs boats. 6 days after the confrontation at my gate, I drove down to my dock at sunrise to check the water gauge. The gauge was bolted to the cedar post my father had set in 1971. I read the level, wrote it in the small green notebook I keep in the boathouse, and turned to walk up to the bench where I drink my coffee. My boat was gone. It was a 14-foot aluminum Lund my father bought used in 1989. Outboard Mercury, 25 horse, mostly dependable. I'd kept it on the dock under a green canvas cover for as long as I'd lived there. The cover was folded neatly and set on the planks like someone had taken time with it. There was a yellow notice taped to the boathouse door. Unauthorized vessel, Lakeshore Pines Estates Marina Association. Per HOA Marina Use Policy 4.7, vessels not registered with the Lakeshore Pines Marina office are subject to impoundment. Your vessel has been moved to the Lakeshore Pines Marina overflow lot, pending payment of a release fee of $1,250. I read it twice. I felt something cold move up the back of my neck. I did not raise my voice. I took the notice off the door, folded it once, and put it in the green notebook. Then I walked the long way around the eastern shoreline, through the cedar grove my mother used to walk in summer, until I came out behind the construction site. They had built a temporary fenced pen on what used to be my pasture. Inside it sat my father's Lund, my neighbor Jed Carmichael's pontoon, and a small kayak I recognized as belonging to the elderly couple who lived in the green cabin past the curve. 3 pieces of private property, none of them ever owned by Lakeshore Pines. All of them locked behind chain link with a padlock that didn't belong to any of us. I took out my phone. I shot a slow, deliberate video. The pen, the lock, the boats, the yellow notices. I narrated the date, the time, the names of the boat owners, and the GPS coordinates from my phone screen. Then I drove into Sandpoint and made notarized copies at a UPS store. That afternoon, Jed Carmichael came over with a 6-pack and a face the color of brick. Jed is 66, a retired heavy equipment mechanic, ran a logging crew up near Priest Lake for 30 years. He doesn't say much. When he does, he means it. "They took my pontoon," he said. "The wife's birthday gift, 2007, $1,500 release fee. Diane Keller stood on my dock and pointed while 3 guys lifted it onto a trailer." "I know," I said. "You gonna let her keep doing this?" I poured him a glass of water and sat down across from him. The maples outside the window were just starting to turn, edges going copper. "I'm building a record," I said. "Every fine, every notice, every act of trespass. When the time is right, I'll deliver all of it at once." He looked at me for a while, then he nodded. "I got cameras," he said. "Trail cameras, 12 of them, from the bear study I helped run 2 winters back. Motion triggered. You want them?" I told him I did. We loaded 12 trail cameras into the back of his truck the next morning. By that night, I had cameras hidden in the cedar grove, in the boathouse rafters, in the hayloft of the old barn, and on a fence post overlooking the Marina pen. Each one was tagged with a battery date and a memory card schedule. Each one would catch them. 3 days later, the first fine arrived in my mailbox. Unauthorized use of community waterway, $850. 2 days after that, a second one. Unauthorized footpath, $400. Then, unauthorized canine, $250. Apparently, my dog walking on my own gravel driveway constituted a violation of the Lakeshore Pines Pet Conduct Code, which I had never agreed to. I filed each fine in the binder. I added a tab. The binder was no longer thin. Here's the practical lesson hidden in those notices, the one most homeowners never learn until it's too late. An HOA can only find the parcels enrolled in its declaration of covenants. The CC and Rs have to be recorded against the property at the county registrar. If your deed predates the HOA and your parcel was never voluntarily annexed, you are not a member, you cannot be fined, and you owe them nothing. Every dollar Diane sent in those envelopes was paper, less than paper. It was confession. By the second week of fines, she'd written me up for $6,200 in violations. By the end of the month, the figure was over $12,000. Each notice was signed in her looping cursive, sealed with the gold foil HOA logo, dated and mailed using the United States Postal Service. Mail fraud is a federal offense when the mail system is used to extort, and every single one of those envelopes would eventually sit in a federal evidence box with her signature on it. I let her keep mailing them. The afternoon the 12th fine arrived, I drove down to the dock at golden hour and sat on the bench where my wife used to sit. The water on Junebug Pond was glass, that pale steel color the high lakes get in early October, and a single loon was calling out near the island. I took a long breath that smelled like cold stone and pine resin. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed the Idaho Department of Water Resources. I asked for Gabriel Whitcomb. He'd been my father's contact 30 years ago. He had retired and come back as a consultant. Wyatt Hollister, I said when he picked up. Junebug Pond, license number on file. I want to schedule my biennial dam inspection, and I want to talk to you about a developer who's built $2 million of unpermitted structure on the impoundment. The line went quiet for a moment. Then I heard him chuckle, very low. Wyatt, he said, I have been waiting for somebody to call me about that pond for 1.5 years. Tell me what time tomorrow. I told him 8 in the morning. Then I sat on that bench and watched the loon for a long time, and the quiet in my chest started to feel less like grief and more like patience. The Marina was finished by the second week of October. They worked 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, with floodlights running into the night. The thing they built was, I'll admit, impressive in a vulgar way. A floating concrete pier ran 200 feet out into the deep water, with finger docks branching off to hold 36 slips. A 2-story timber pavilion stood at the shore end, with a wraparound deck, a stone fireplace, and an outdoor bar finished in slate. The gravel ramp had been paved over and striped for boat trailers. 6 pole-mounted speakers were aimed at the water for shoreline ambiance programming. A wooden archway at the entry road read, Lakeshore Pines Marina, a private community, in burnt edge lettering. It was, by the contractor's own bid documents, $2.2 million of new construction. Every dollar of it sat on land that did not belong to Lakeshore Pines Estates. Diane planned a ribbon cutting for the Saturday before Halloween. She called it the Founders Day Soft Open. She rented a 40-foot welcome arch in pearl white and gold. She hired a string quartet from Spokane. She had embossed invitations sent to the entire HOA membership, 3 county commissioners, the editor of the Sandpoint paper, a real estate columnist from Coeur d'Alene, and the Bonner County Sheriff. She did not invite me. I drove down to the foot of the entry road that Saturday afternoon anyway, because Junebug Pond is mine, and there is no day of the year I do not have the right to walk to the water on my own land. A man in a black polo shirt with the Marina logo on the chest stepped out of a folding chair and held up his hand. He was big, mid-30s, an earpiece in his right ear and a clipboard against his hip. Sir, this is a private event. You'll need an invitation. I own the land you're standing on, I said, from the gate to the water and 300 yards in either direction. Sir, I have a list. If you're not on the list, you can't come in. Diane saw the exchange from the pavilion deck and walked down with the kind of slow, satisfied stride that tells you somebody has been waiting weeks to do exactly that walk. Cream cashmere sweater, dark jeans, leather riding boots, a wine glass in her hand. Mr. Hollister, she said, I am so glad you came, but this is a members-only event. I'm sure you understand. I understand the boundary line is 40 feet behind you, I said. I understand the dock you're standing on rests on land deeded to my family in 1948. She tilted her head. Mr. Hollister, the board has determined that your interpretation of those documents is in error. We have legal counsel. We have approved permits. We have the support of the Planning Commission. I will not be lectured on my own dock. I looked past her at the string quartet on the deck. I looked at the ribbon waiting on the railing. I looked at the dozen well-dressed couples laughing under the gazebo, with champagne flutes in their hands. Enjoy your party, Mrs. Keller, I said. I turned around and walked back to my truck. The security guard watched me the whole way. That evening I sat in my kitchen with the green folder open and the binder beside it. The Sandpoint paper had already published a Sunday feature, headlined, Crown Jewel of North Idaho's Newest Lakeside Community. A real estate firm had issued a press release announcing a 40% increase in average home value at Lakeshore Pines, attributable to the Marina. The HOA had begun marketing 12 new lots adjacent to the original 42, priced at $1.8 million each, with private boat slip access included. Diane Keller had built her entire empire on the assumption that the water in Junebug Pond would always be where it currently was. There is an old principle in dam engineering that my grandfather taught me, sitting on the spillway one summer afternoon when I was 9 years old. He said, "Son, every dam is a promise. You make a promise to the water, and the water makes a promise back. The day you forget who is in charge, the water reminds you. I closed the binder. I walked outside. I stood at the spillway in the dark and listened to the lake breathing against the concrete. The siphon valve was 30 feet to my left, in the small pump house my grandfather had built in 1953. I had not opened it in 11 years. I knew exactly how to. I did not open it that night. I went back inside, and I made one more phone call. The first time I'd seen the construction permits in the records request packet, I'd noticed something I could not quite explain. The Marina permits had been approved on a Monday in March, just 4 business days after the application was filed. Marina permits in Bonner County typically take 90 to 120 days. They require an Army Corps wetlands review, an Idaho Fish and Game riparian assessment, and a public comment period of at least 30 days. This permit had skipped all of that. Each waiver had been signed by the same man on the same day. Tom Keller, vice chair of the Bonner County Planning Commission, Diane's husband. I called Margaret at the county clerk's office. I asked her one specific question. I asked her if there had been any payments, fee transfers, or fund movements between the Marina contractor and any commissioner's known business address in the 6 months preceding the permit approval. She said, "Wyatt, I'm going to need to call you back from a different phone." She called me back 20 minutes later from a payphone outside a gas station in Pend Oreille. What she told me lasted 4 minutes. When she was done, I sat at my kitchen table with the phone still warm in my hand, and I understood that the situation had changed. A no-bid contractor named Stillwater Marine had been awarded the Marina build. Stillwater Marine was a Wyoming LLC that had been incorporated 38 days before the bid. Its registered agent was a law office in Cheyenne. Its sole listed officer, behind 2 layers of holding companies, was a man named Tom Keller of Sandpoint, Idaho. The HOA had paid $2.2 million for a marina built on stolen land, awarded without competition, to a shell company owned by the husband of the woman who voted to approve the spending. That, in legal terms, is called self-dealing. In federal terms, it is called wire fraud, mail fraud, and honest services fraud, all at once. I made one more pot of coffee. I opened a new tab in my binder. I labeled it in pencil, Federal. The water in the lake answered to me. The fraud and the paperwork answered to the FBI. And both of those things were going to arrive at Founders Day Regatta. Gabriel Whitcomb arrived at my gate at 2 minutes past 8 the following Tuesday morning. He drove a state truck with a small cracked windshield. He carried a leather satchel that had to be older than I was. He was 72, white-haired, walked with a slight limp from a fall off a spillway in 1986, and he knew more about earth and dam hydraulics than any living engineer in the western United States. We walked the spillway together. He ran his hand along the concrete. He noted the date stamp my grandfather had pressed into the wet pour. J. H. May, 14th, 52. He measured the freeboard. He inspected the keyway, the seepage drains, the toe of the embankment. He took photographs. Then we walked to the pump house, and he stopped at the door. "This is the original siphon, Wyatt?" "Yes, sir. 6-inch line. Inverted U over the embankment. Manual prime, gravity discharge to the creek bed. Tested every 2 years. Last test was 19 months ago. Discharge rate measured at 190 gallons per minute." He looked at me over his glasses. "I'm going to ask you a question, and you do not have to answer it. As the licensed dam operator, do you have any current concern about the structural integrity of this impoundment that would require an emergency drawdown to inspect and repair?" I looked at him for a long second. "Gabriel," I said, "I have a major unpermitted structure built into the impoundment, without engineering review, without freeboard analysis, without an Army Corps wetlands sign-off, and without any consultation with the licensed operator. The pylons were driven without core sampling. As the licensed operator, I am obligated to perform a visual inspection of the embankment and bed in conditions of full drawdown." He wrote that down word for word on his clipboard. He signed his name at the bottom. He tore off the carbon copy and handed it to me. "Mr. Hollister," he said, "as the State Dam Safety Officer for District 5, I am authorizing an emergency drawdown of Junebug Pond at the licensed operator's discretion for the purpose of structural inspection. The drawdown must be coordinated with downstream notification and may proceed at any time within the next 90 days. State law preempts any private agreement that would interfere with this safety inspection. He folded his copy into his satchel. He shook my hand. Good luck, Wyatt. Your father would be proud. As he climbed back into his truck, he said one last thing through the open window. Funny thing about siphons, they don't make a lot of noise. You can run one all night, and the only person who knows is the man at the valve. He drove off down the gravel. The next 2 weeks were the quietest I had ever lived. I worked methodically. Every morning I checked my trail cameras. Every afternoon I added pages to the binder. Every evening I sat at the kitchen table with the green folder, going through the damn construction documents one more time, until I had memorized the discharge schedule by heart. I called the FBI field office in Coeur d'Alene on a Wednesday. I asked to speak with the agent who handled public corruption tips. I was on the phone with a special agent named Eleanor Wexler for 98 minutes. I emailed her 7 attachments: the Marina permits, the Stillwater Marine corporate filings, the HOA assessment vote, the contractor invoices, Tom Keller's Planning Commission disclosure forms, the no-bid waiver, and the bank routing data Margaret had pulled from the public ledger of municipal payments. Agent Wexler called me back the next morning. She used the word actionable. She used the word patterns. She asked me to keep building the file and to call her the moment Diane took any further enforcement action against me. She said the Bureau preferred to act on a complete record. I told her I expected an opportunity to deliver one within 30 days. I called Jed and asked him to bring a post-hole digger to my place on Friday. We spent 6 hours putting up new signs along the entire shoreline. Private property, Hollister family estate, no trespassing, no commercial access. We marked the survey line with orange ribbon every 20 feet. We posted the warning that this parcel was an active state-licensed dam impoundment, subject to drawdown notice without further warning to non-permitted occupants. I called my downstream neighbor, an old rancher named Owen Tesmer, who runs 40 head of cattle on the bottomland that catches the Spillway Creek. I told him what I was about to do, when, and why. I asked him to keep his livestock off the lower meadow for 36 hours. He laughed for about a minute, then he said, "Wyatt, I'll buy you a steak when you're done." I called Hannah. I told her, in plain terms, what I was going to do and why. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Daddy, Mom would have wanted you to do this. Open the valve." The Founders' Day Regatta was scheduled for the second Saturday in November. Diane had moved the date up by 3 weeks because the Sandpoint paper had agreed to do a full-color magazine spread tied to the event. 48 invited guests, 12 out-of-state real estate investors flown in for the weekend, 3 commissioners, 2 state senators, a live band on a barge, a catered seafood dinner under the gazebo. Plates set at $500 per donation to the Lakeshore Pines Founders Endowment, which was a fund Diane had created to install permanent statuary along the shoreline. Statues of, by the program description, the original founders of Lakeshore Pines. Founders, plural, of an HOA that had existed for 16 months. I bought a new battery for the headlamp I kept in the pump house. I tested the siphon prime fittings. I cleaned the discharge cap. I greased the valve handle until it turned with one finger. I checked the weather. The forecast called for clear skies, light wind, and a high of 46. The full moon would rise over the eastern ridge at 6:53 on Friday evening. I made one last call. I dialed the Sandpoint Daily Bee newsroom and asked for Ellis Reed, the reporter who had written the Marina feature. I told him that on Saturday morning, at the Lakeshore Pines Founders' Day Regatta, he might want to bring an extra photographer. I told him there would be a story worth the gas. He asked what it was about. I said, "Bring a camera, Mr. Reed. The lake is going to write its own headline." Diane must have sensed something, the way a coyote senses a shift in the wind. She came at me 3 times in the last 2 weeks before the regatta, and each move was uglier than the one before. The first move was a harassment complaint. She filed a sworn statement with the Bonner County Sheriff, alleging that I had stalked her on her dock, made a threatening gesture at her son, and used intimidating eye contact toward HOA volunteers. A sheriff's deputy I had known since high school, a man named Hal Lawson, drove out to my house on a Tuesday afternoon with the complaint in a folder and a tired expression on his face. We sat on my porch in the cold sun. He read me the complaint out loud. When he was done, he closed the folder. Wyatt, you and I both know this is nothing, but she's filed 3 of these in the last 6 months on 3 different residents. I have to record that I came out and spoke with you. I'd appreciate if you didn't give me reason to come back. Hal, I said, I have 12 trail cameras on my property and a binder thick enough to hold a doorstop. The only thing that's going to happen on my land in the next 10 days is whatever the lake decides to do. He looked at me for a long moment. Anything you want me to know, Wyatt, ahead of time? I told him to be at the Marina at 8:30 on Saturday morning, in uniform, and bring a second deputy. I told him there would not be a fight. I told him there would be a story worth witnessing, and I would feel better if a man I trusted was on the gravel. He nodded once and drove off. The second move came 3 days later. I came back from town to find all 4 tires on my truck slashed. Clean cuts, a pocket knife job. There was a folded HOA notice tucked under my windshield wiper, advising me that I was in violation of the Lakeshore Pines Vehicle Aesthetic Ordinance, and that any further parking infractions would result in towing. The trail camera on the gate post had captured the entire thing. A teenage kid in a Lakeshore Pines polo shirt, hoodie up, pocket knife in hand, walking from tire to tire while looking over his shoulder. The kid was Diane's 17-year-old son, Brock Keller. The footage was time-stamped, GPS tagged, and 4 kinds of clean. I drove into Sandpoint on the spare and bought 4 new tires. I added the footage to the binder. The third move was the worst, and it came from Tom. A certified letter arrived on Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the regatta. It was on Bonner County Planning Commission letterhead. It was signed by Tom Keller, vice chair. It informed me that the Planning Commission had voted, in a session I had never been notified of, to commence an administrative review of my water rights diversion on Junebug Pond. It stated that pending the outcome of that review, my dam license might be subject to revocation under a section of code that did not exist. It demanded that I appear at a special hearing the following Wednesday and bring all documentation related to my use of the impoundment for the past 45 years. It was, in plain English, a threat. Tom Keller was telling me that if I made trouble for the Marina, he would find a way to take my dam, my lake, and my grandfather's life work away from me through bureaucratic process. I read the letter 3 times. I made a copy for the binder. I scanned a copy and emailed it to Special Agent Wexler at the FBI. I put a flag on the email that said, "Attempted intimidation of federal witness, public corruption investigation." Agent Wexler called me back inside of an hour. Her voice was very calm. "Mr. Hollister, would you object if a federal agent attended your Saturday event?" I said I would not object. I said I would prefer it. She said, "We will be there." That night I sat in the kitchen with my dog at my feet and the spillway behind the house humming the way it always does in November, a low, steady note like a held breath. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt the way I imagined my grandfather felt the day he closed the gate on the new pond and watched the water rise for the first time. Quiet, awake, aware that what I was about to do was permanent. Friday morning I drove down to the dock at 6. I checked the gauge. I checked the wind. I walked the spillway one more time. The water was glass, cold enough that my breath hung over it like cigarette smoke. I went into the pump house. I closed the inflow valve from the spring inlet, the small one my grandfather had wired in 1953, so the lake could be isolated from its source. I opened the prime line on the siphon. I primed the inverted U with a hand pump, the kind we used to use to start a boat motor. I held the handle steady. I felt the line jump as the water column took hold. I opened the discharge valve at 6:41 in the evening, just as the moon cleared the eastern ridge. I heard the line gulp once, hard, like a man taking a deep breath. Then I heard the steady, sustained rush of 190 gallons of cold November lake water, moving through 6 inches of pipe and out into the spillway creek bed below the embankment. I closed the pump house door. I walked up to the house. I made a cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the binder open in front of me, and I waited. 18 acres, average depth 9 feet. Total volume came to roughly 53 million gallons. At 190 gallons per minute, the math was clean. By sunrise, the pond would be down by 7.5 feet and dry to mud across most of its bed by mid-morning. By the time Diane Keller's first guest pulled into the Marina parking lot, Junebug Pond would be a memory. I did not sleep that night. I did not need to. I sat at the kitchen window and watched the moon track across the eastern half of the sky. Around 2 in the morning, I walked down to the spillway in the cold and listened. The siphon was still running, steady as a held organ note. The discharge creek below the embankment was loud now, full and rushing where it had been a trickle at sundown. I shined my headlamp at the gauge post. The water line was already 4 feet below the spring mark. The sky went pale at 6:50. By 7, the first orange streaks hit the ridge. I stepped onto the porch with my coat zipped and walked down the gravel toward the water. What I saw stopped me in the road. Junebug Pond was gone. In its place was a vast, glistening, dark gray basin of cracked clay and exposed lake bed. 18 acres of mud running edge to edge under a thin morning fog. The Marina pier, 200 feet of poured concrete and aluminum framing, hung suspended from its pylons 15 feet above the bottom, looking like a child's pier model held up by stilts. The 36 finger docks tilted at angles, some collapsed into the muck. The 2-story pavilion, designed to overhang the water by 12 feet, now floated in midair over a dry shore. And there were boats, 12 boats, wedged into the mud at angles God had never designed any boat to sit at, a pontoon on its side, a cabin cruiser keeled over with its hull cracked, a wellcraft on its bow with the propellers in the air, a bass boat half buried, its outboard sunk to the engine head, $40,000 yachts and $100,000 pleasure boats, and one small kayak, all of them sitting in stinking lakebed silt that had not seen sunlight in 73 years. The smell hit me a second after the sight. Cold, rotting algae, old freshwater muck, the mineral tang of submerged limestone, the sour vegetable bite of decomposing pondweed. It was the smell of a lake skeleton. The first car arrived at 7:52, a pearl Lexus. A man in a Patagonia vest stepped out, walked 20 feet toward the pavilion, stopped, and stood very still for about 4 seconds. Then he turned around, got back in the car, and sat with both hands on the wheel. By 8:15, 23 vehicles had pulled into the lot. The string quartet from Spokane stood near the gazebo, with their cases unopened. The catering truck was offloading silver chafing dishes onto a folding table that overlooked nothing but mud. The 2 state senators stood at the railing of the pavilion deck with their drinks in hand and their mouths slightly open. Diane Keller arrived at 8:28. She was in a white wool coat over a navy dress. Her hair was set. Her makeup was perfect. She walked from her Range Rover to the edge of the pavilion deck without breaking stride, looked over the rail, and stopped. I watched her from the gravel rise above the gate, with Jed beside me and Hal Lawson's patrol cruiser parked 20 feet away. I had a folder under my arm. I was wearing the brown canvas jacket my father had bought me in 1989. The dog was at my heel. She did not see me at first. She just stood at the railing, looking at the mud where her Marina was supposed to be. The wind moved her hair. Her face went through 3 colors in about 10 seconds. Pale, then red, then a sort of waxy yellow that made her cheeks look hollow. Then she turned, scanned the gravel, found me, and started walking. She crossed the parking lot at a hard, brisk stride that broke into a half-run by the time she reached the gate. The security guard tried to step in. I waved him off. Hal Lawson stepped out of his cruiser and stood with his hands on his belt. "What did you do?" she said. She was loud now. The string quartet stopped pretending to tune. "What did you do to my lake?" "Mrs. Keller," I said, "I performed an authorized emergency drawdown of a state-licensed dam impoundment with the written authorization of the Idaho Department of Water Resources, dated October 14th. I am the licensed operator. The drawdown was conducted pursuant to a structural inspection mandate. Notice was provided to all downstream water users." "This is my Marina," she said. Her voice was breaking. "This is $2 million of construction. You destroyed my lake." "It is not your lake," I said. "It has never been your lake. The deed is in my name, and was in my father's name, and my grandfather's name before that. The dam is licensed to me. The water rights are vested in my parcel. The Marina you built is a trespass. As for what I destroyed, ma'am, I did not destroy a thing. I temporarily relocated water that belongs to me to a downstream creek bed where it can do an honest day's work. The water will return when I open the spring inlet. The Marina is yours to remove. That was when the second vehicle pulled into the lot, a black Ford Explorer with federal plates. 2 agents stepped out in dark windbreakers with the bureau letters across the back. A third agent followed in a separate sedan. Special Agent Eleanor Wexler walked straight across the parking lot and identified herself in a voice that carried. Diane Keller, Tom Keller, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, mail fraud, honest services fraud, and bid rigging in connection with the contract awarded to Stillwater Marine. You have the right to remain silent. Tom Keller, who had just walked out of the pavilion in a navy blazer with a champagne flute in his hand, dropped the flute on the deck. The glass did not break. It simply rolled off the edge and fell 15 feet to the mud below. The string quartet finally put their instruments back in their cases. The catering crew stopped unloading. The 2 state senators set their drinks down on the railing, very carefully, and walked, in step, back to their car. Ellis Reed from the Sandpoint paper was already there. He had arrived at 7:30. His photographer had been on the bluff above the gate since 6. They had 140 photographs of the entire morning, including the moment Tom Keller was put in handcuffs in front of the burnt-edge Lakeshore Pines Marina archway. Diane was last. She was led across the parking lot in her white wool coat with her wrists behind her back. As she passed me at the gate, she stopped. She looked at me with an expression I will remember the rest of my life. It was not anger anymore. It was the pure, total, uncomprehending confusion of a person who has spent so long believing the world will bend to her that she cannot, in real time, accept that it has not. She said, "But it was just a lake." I said, "No, ma'am, it was my grandfather." I closed the discharge valve at noon. By that afternoon, I had reopened the spring inlet, and the slow business of refilling Junebug Pond began. A spring-fed lake of 18 acres takes about 4 months to recover its full pool. I sat on the bench every morning with my coffee and watched the level rise an inch, then 2, then a foot. The loons came back in February. By the time the dogwoods bloomed in May, Junebug Pond was full to the freeboard mark my grandfather had carved into the cedar gauge post in 1953. The marina did not survive the spring thaw. The pylons, set without core sampling and stressed by months of unsupported load, cracked at the waterline when the level rose around them. The HOA's insurance carrier denied every claim, citing fraudulent permits. By June, the marina was a half-floating, half-sunken pile of warped timber and broken concrete, and the receiver appointed by the federal court ordered the entire structure removed at HOA expense. Diane Keller pleaded out the following October. 18 months in federal custody, 3 years of supervised release, full restitution to the 42 homeowners who had paid the special assessment, and a permanent ban from holding any officer position in any homeowners association in any state for the remainder of her life. Tom Keller got 30 months. Stillwater Marine was dissolved. The Bonner County Planning Commission revised its no-bid waiver process. The 42 Lakeshore Pines homeowners were, to be fair, mostly decent people who had simply trusted the wrong board. 29 of them came down to my house in the months after the arrests, in 2s and 3s, to apologize. One brought a bottle of bourbon that had been in his father's cabinet for 40 years. I shook every hand. I told every one of them that the lake had room for honest neighbors, and that the gate was open to anyone who walked up to it, carrying a fishing rod and a quiet voice. Hannah came home for Christmas. We sat on the bench by the water in the cold and watched the moon rise over the eastern ridge. She held my hand. She told me her mother would have laughed for an hour. In the spring, I did one more thing. I sat down with Gabriel Whitcomb, with Owen Tesmer, the rancher, and with a young attorney from a land trust in Sandpoint, and we drew up the documents to place a permanent conservation easement on the entire 18-acre lake and the surrounding 40 acres of shoreline. The easement was donated to the Idaho Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The terms were simple. The lake stays in the Hollister family during my lifetime, then passes into a public conservation trust under one condition. It must be used for one purpose, free of charge, every summer Saturday from June through August. A children's fishing program. Up to 30 kids per Saturday. Local kids, foster kids, kids from any background. Free rods, free bait, free instruction, free lemonade. We named the program after my wife, the Junebug Saturdays. The first Junebug Saturday was held the second weekend of June. 28 kids showed up. Hannah ran the front check-in. Jed ran the casting station. I stood on the bench by the water with the dog at my side and watched a 7-year-old boy with a missing front tooth land his first bluegill, and the sound of his shout when the fish broke the surface was the best sound I had heard in 3 years. So that's how the story ended. $2 million of stolen Marina, gone. A corrupt HOA president and her commissioner husband in federal custody. A lake my grandfather built with a wheelbarrow, restored to its rightful owner, and dedicated to children who would never have to ask anyone's permission to fish on a free piece of water. If you've ever been bullied by a board, lied to by a developer, or pushed off land that was yours by a person who thought a clipboard outranked a deed, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. The community in this comment section is the best part of every video, and your story might be the next one I tell. If you made it to the end and felt the satisfaction of watching that mud appear at sunrise, do me one favor, hit subscribe. There is another HOA story coming next week, and I promise you it is even crazier than this one. Until then, take care of your land, keep your records, and never forget which one of you is holding the valve.
Here's the thing about Danny Keller and every petty tyrant who looks like her. They don't fall because somebody yelled louder. They fall because they assume the quiet man at the end of the road was just an old widower with a fishing pole, when in fact he was a 31-year civil engineer with a state license, a green folder of original document, and the patience of a man who has already lost the most important person in his life and has nothing left that scares him. Wyatt Hollister won because he prepared, because he kept records, because he made one phone call instead of one tweet, because he understood that the law worked for the person who resists, not the person who shouts. And the lake came back. The kids fish on it every Saturday. And a little girl somewhere will land her first bluegill on water a developer once tried to steal. If you lived through your own HOA nightmare, share it in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, where a retired Marine takes on a homeowners association that's built a security gate across his grandfather's logging road. Until then, keep your paperwork, keep your patience, and remember, the loudest person in the room is almost never the one in charge.